Well, good morning. Thanks for being here. We are going to be continuing in the third part of our series on community. It's been a theme we've been exploring, which will culminate next week in what we call at Bridgeway Connect Sunday. Now, the idea behind Connect Sunday is very simple. We've been working towards becoming more and more practical and pointed in each teaching. And so next week is going to all be about taking the step into community. And so if you have yet to engage in a small group in particular, we're going to be sharing with you about what that looks like. We're going to try to make it as easy for you to get information and to sign up for a group as possible. So next week you're going to see there's going to be a bunch of tables in here with representatives from our different groups. And our hope and our prayer is that you will, if you have not yet, take a step into community. And so I'm looking forward to working towards that next week. But also, you know that each week after the service times, there is a representative at our info table, for a group representative who has more information on what it means to get involved with the group if you're looking to get information before Connect Sunday. So that's where we're heading. But I hope for us that this has been just these last few weeks have been an opportunity for us to really ask God to speak to us about community as He shapes our community. And so today we're going to unpack a theme of relating to one another, of community that I think is oftentimes neglected. And maybe you'll find out why. I want to talk about the rules of community. You know, one of the things I've noticed is that every community organization, whether that's an association, a club, even a family, we all have rules. And then sometimes these are explicit, sort of just posted on the front door, but sometimes they're implied, or sometimes have you ever heard of a rule that you only learned because you broke it, right? And I want to suggest that all communities, all churches, all organizations have various rules that hold them together, but I think we have to acknowledge some of the challenges. First of all, there can be a certain sense in which rules can really hinder community. Have you ever, who here, just out of curiosity, who here belongs to an HOA? Yeah, I'm just wondering if that same group would say that HOA, your HOA rules help or hinder community. For instance, I found some of these, and you can't make some of these things up. I found a list of just outrageous HOA rules, and I think some of these things might, in fact, hinder community. Let's see if you agree. One of the HOAs has an annual garage sale, like a community garage sale, but you've seen those before. But this one's special because anyone who wanted to participate had to wear polos and khakis. Yeah, right? You had to tuck in your shirt, right? We're not going to have any kind of riffraff at our garage sale. Not at this HOA. Another HOA required architectural approval for 2 potted plants that somebody wanted to put in their porch. One neighborhood HOA pool would fine you $25 if you brought your own towel. So that's pretty serious. One rule said that you could not have your garage door open for more than 5 minutes or you would face a fine. Right? We might agree that sometimes rules inhibit community, but there are other times where there's a little more ambiguity here. For instance, think about just house rules. One of the things I've just noticed that if I ever go to someone's house that I've never been to before, one of the first things I'll do is I'll shake someone's hand and walk through. But I immediately look at their feet. Do you know why? Is this a shoes on or a shoes off kind of family, right? And I always wear my nicest matching socks whenever I do, just in case it's a shoes off household, because nothing is more embarrassing than 2, broke socks where your toes are sticking out, right? We have rules, like family rules. Like when I was a kid, my friends would come over and they would try to do something, and my mom would say, well, guess what? In this house, we don't do that. All right, there are house rules. There are different rules. There are also rules that, again, we find out when we break them. For instance, I recently was trying to sell something on Facebook Marketplace, and I came across this issue. I was selling a knife, a hunting knife, and I wasn't using it anymore, so I'm like, I'm just going to sell this, and there's kitchen knives and things on Facebook, right? So I said, hunting knife for sale, whatever. And instantly, I got a nasty gram from Facebook saying that I was in violation of their community guidelines. which I thought was very, very strange. I actually found out that you could repost the same ad as camping tool, and it goes up just fine. So I was able to get around that community guideline. Right, but we have rules. And the idea of rules, I think the implicit idea behind rules at least, is that they help us foster a sense of community, or at least that's the purpose. Now, the question comes from that for our discussion today is, what about rules as it pertains to church? And my guess is all of a sudden rules in church, right, that might strike some of us as that doesn't feel right, does it? And I think there's probably two reasons why. And the first reason is that as Americans, and if you come from a different context, I think you can at least sort of feel this with your American friends. As Americans, we have a very strong anti-authoritarian and individualistic bent, just baked into our cultural understanding. And we talked about this in week 1, but I want to come back to this because I want to suggest to you that American individualism is one of the biggest challenges that we face towards creating legitimate and authentic community. We are programmed, especially in the West, to think as individuals, as autonomous entities that only relate to one another if we want to or if it benefits us. And this is challenging because actually Scripture itself was produced for and by, or at least by and in Eastern cultures, all of which are collectivist cultures. And this is important, right? Because there are underlying assumptions and values that we miss out on because, again, we're American individualists. For instance, in Eastern culture, there are oftentimes honor and shame paradigms that work to shape community. For instance, in Eastern cultures, your primary identity is not you, it is the group or family or tribe that you belong to. Right? The idea of you kind of pulling yourselves up out of your bootstraps and making something out of your life, that is a totally foreign concept in most Eastern cultures, especially ones that are the biblical cultures that produce the Bible. And so we see here that there is a strong idea that what you do doesn't reflect on you, but it reflects on your family, on your tribe. And there's a huge pressure in these cultures to conform to a group. They are collectivist cultures. And in America, as you may have gathered, we are exactly the opposite. In fact, there's one commentator, David Brooks, he said this about American individualism, and I think this is right on the money. He says this, quote, "Hyper-individualism, the reigning ethos of our day, is a system of morals, feelings, ideas, and practices based on the idea that the journey through life is an individual journey, that the goals of life are individual happiness, authenticity, self-actualization, and self-sufficiency. Hyper-individualism puts the same question on everybody's lips: what can I do to make myself happy?" End quote. I think this is a very apt description of American culture. We pride the idea of what we can do, how we can transcend our family of origin, our background, right? We can make ourselves we can create our own path into the world. That's baked into the American ideal. And so I want to suggest that right at the outset, we have a strong tendency away from community. I also think that there is an anti-institutional bias that I know that is very strong in American culture, and especially in our kind of current political and kind of cultural and economic moment, right? We are very skeptical of anything that tries to exert influence or control over us, are we not? Remind you that we have a country because we didn't like a king telling us what to do. So we created our own country. And there's a lot of us today who have a lot of suspicion and mistrust about any kind of entity, whether that's the government or the church. I want to suggest that these are real barriers for Christian community. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But there's another reason why we might push back on the idea that rules should ever be present in the church, and because it is this, isn't it true that rules are opposed to grace? Right? We're the church, right? We should be accepting of everyone, no matter what they do, what your past is, correct? I mean, that's true. Yeah, that's not a trick question, right? That's our ideal as a church, right? We want everyone, right? We say this: come as you are, but there's a qualifier. but don't stay that way. And I think even that there's a tension there, right? There's acceptance, forgiveness, there's grace, but there's also a certain degree of expectation that as we together are being shaped by Christ, as we're indwelt by the Holy Spirit, right, as he's sanctifying us, that the person we were 5 years ago should not look like the same person we are today. And so we hold these things in tension. Again, some of us, we fall into a flaw on one side of this or the other. On one hand, we have people who are communities that tend towards legalism. And maybe you've grown up in that kind of culture where if you made one small infraction, if you admitted to one sin, you were ostracized by your community. That's wrong. That's opposed to grace. That's opposed to forgiveness. But on the other side, we fall into the trap of antinomianism, or this, nomian means law. Basically, there's no law, there's no rules. Jesus' grace covers you. So at the end of the day, who am I to say anything about you or how you live your life? And I want to suggest that these are two errors. In fact, we see very clearly through the New Testament, there is a huge attention paid to how we live together in community, and frankly, how our conduct matters. In fact, there are a number of places, at least 3 in the New Testament, where Paul, in terms of talking about church, he actually tells us that if there are people who, if you will forgive the phrase, who break the rules habitually and intentionally, to remove them from fellowship. And let's just look at a few, because I think this should help to understand the stakes of this conversation. Writing to the Corinthian church, Paul says this: you are not to associate with anyone who claims to be a believer, yet indulges in sexual sin, or is greedy, or worship idols, or is abusive, or is a drunkard, or cheats people. Do not even eat with such people. It's pretty stark, isn't it? And what he's talking about here, he qualifies this. I'm not talking about people in the world. He says, I'm talking about people in the church who are claiming Christ, who are saying, hey, I'm a brother and I'm a sister, right? I'm a disciple of Jesus, yet they refuse to abstain from these types of sins. He says, and the assumption here also is that these are probably habitual, reoccurring sins. These are not simply isolated incidents, but if you are persisting in these sins, he says, don't even eat with them. He also says this to Timothy, who is a leader in the church at Ephesus. He says, those who sin should be reprimanded in front of the whole church. This will serve as a strong warning to others. Right? You think changing up the communion format's going to get people excited? It's like, Tristan, stand up. Yet that is precisely what Paul is talking about. With persistent sin, habitual sin. He says, reprimand it. Why? And he says, do it publicly. He says in Titus, he says, if people are causing divisions among you, give a first warning and a second warning. And then after that, he says, have nothing more to do with them. For people like that have turned from the truth and their own sins condemn them. It's like, whoa. But I hope that raises the stakes a little bit. So what Paul is talking about, when we're thinking about grace and when we're thinking about forgiveness and community, we are not by any stretch here saying, hey, you know what, come as you are and do what you want and belong here without any qualification. Paul, as it were, lays some ground rules. There are expectations. There are certain values that he wants us to strive towards as a community. And he says, actually, when we do, the beauty is that we actually create really strong community. And in these instances here, though they are extreme and probably the outliers, right? We should not be excommunicating people from the church every other day, and that's important. But he says it's important enough, though, when push comes to shove, protecting the unity of the community, protecting the holiness and sanctification of the body. He says it matters enough to where you might have to take extreme action. And so today I want to look at some passages that outline some principles that I've titled today's sermon, Community Guidelines, because they help us to understand some principles for creating communities that last, communities that honor Christ, and ultimately that serve the body. And so we could look at, I'm sure, many, many examples. I'm going to focus on 3 guidelines. We could call them rules if you like, but 3 aspects of community that help to shape us as God's people. And the 3 that we're going to look at today are, first, authority. We're going to look at commitment, and then thirdly, the law of love. And so let's work our way through these today. Again, we're not working through a particular passage, but I want to just kind of direct us to a few places in the New Testament that speak to some of these values and these guidelines. So again, let's look at authority first. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, Peter is concluding his letter, and he addresses this question of community, but specifically how authority in the church is supposed to operate. He says, "Now as an elder myself, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as one who shares in the glory to be revealed, I exhort the elders among you to tend the flock of God that is in your charge, exercising the oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you do it. Not for sordid gain, but eagerly. Do not lord it over those in your charge, but be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears," and he's referring to Jesus there, "you will win the crown of glory that never fades. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. And all of you must clothe yourselves with humility in your dealings with one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Now, in this passage, it appears that Peter is singling out elders or overseers. We call them sometimes shepherds at Bridgeway. But these appear to be people who have been placed in official roles of authority in the church. And the implication is, I think, elders, that they're generally speaking older than the average congregant. I think that's the implication here. In any event, we have to look here at this principle because we see right here baked into Peter's teaching. He says there has to be in the church a proper understanding of godly authority. He says, first of all, the people who are placed in authority, there are lots of things that the Bible says about the qualifications, the types of people that you are to allow in those types of positions. They need to be above reproach and so forth and so on. Right? So there's a lot of emphasis there. But just notice here, there is a clear value of authority, both exercising authority and honoring authority. And I think this is important for us too. If we extend this analogy, right, one of the most common metaphors for the church is a family. It's the family of God. And we know that this is true, first of all, in our families. I think you could trace most family dysfunction to a failure of parents exercising godly authority in their homes. Again, there's lots of qualifications there we need to make, but we see a common issue with kids is not kids, it's parents. I remember one time we went to see a family counselor. We were having some challenges with parenting. We're like, man, these kids are just, these boys, they're just killing us. We have 3 young boys. And for an hour and a half, the counselor told me what the real problem is. Guess who it is? It's not Jack, Wes, or Noah. It's dad, mom, mostly dad, of course. Yeah. Right. We see that in healthy families, there is a proper authority that comes from mom and dad, that it's honored and respected by children. And ironically, it actually doesn't lead to oppression and just like, it actually leads to thriving. Proper authority creates healthy families, and we are a family. And we see that time and time again, in terms of the New Testament's teaching on the church, there is a value of godly authority and of honoring that authority, because again, it ultimately fosters healthy community. Now, of course, it would be remiss for us not to address the qualification, godly leadership. Because a lot of us, again, one of the causes of our anti-institutional bias is the fact that we've seen a lot of ungodly leadership, both inside and outside the church. There are times in the church where leaders have been abusive, they have been coercive, they have been spiritually manipulative. And so there are in some ways appropriate maybe caution flags going on in your life because you're like, hey, you don't know my church experience. And on one hand, I want to affirm that, man, that happens. And if that's been your story, I am so sorry that you were mishandled by a leader in authority. That is wrong. It's sinful. They will have to account for those leadership decisions one day. And I'm sorry if that's taken you back in your spiritual journey. But because there are abuses, that does not negate the underlying principle. In fact, Jesus talks about what godly leadership looks like. Of course, Jesus himself embodies this, but he has to teach his disciples, right? There's a story famously where Jesus is walking on the road and two of his disciples, James and John, are kind of bickering against themselves. They're basically saying, hey, who's going to be Jesus' right-hand man? And they're vying for this position of authority, and they're wanting the top job. And he actually addresses this with them. He says, you know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people. Right? It's this top-down authoritarian culture. Their officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, right, Jesus people, disciples, it will be different. For whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. Right, so here we have this picture. On one hand, we have godly authority, right? That godly authority means it's self-sacrificing. It always places the people under their care as the primary concern and focus. Right? It makes it impossible to be a godly leader who abuses that authority, right? That's a contradiction in terms. And just because you're a pastor doesn't mean you're a godly leader. Nevertheless, we see time and time again that we cannot get away from the idea of authority. God gives us authority in our lives because it helps us grow. And I think it's important for all of us, myself included, to take a moment to evaluate what is my relationship to spiritual authority. Like, are there people in my life, maybe a small group leader, it could be one of our vocational ministers, it could be an elder or a group thereof. Like, what is my relationship to them? Am I in a position where if they addressed a legitimate spiritual issue, maybe even one that I wasn't fully aware of, would I respond in an honoring, godly way? Or would I take the option that many people do, which is to simply say, hey, you know what? That's the reason why there's a Second Baptist church in town. And I want to, again, allowing for the fact that there have been legitimate instances of spiritual abuse. I know of a lot of people who I've sat down with, and they're like, oh, you don't know about my last church, my last pastor, man, he called me, like, who is he? And I'm just like, well, it seems like what you're getting there is godly counsel. It seems like you have a leader that God placed over you who's willing to speak some pretty hard things to you, and you are not listening, and you're rebelling, and you're running to another church. Happens all the time. And I think this is a little aside. Just remember that when Paul talks about disfellowship, what we call excommunication in the New Testament, there was no other church in Corinth. This is an important stake, right? You're being removed from the entire spiritual community of faith. Something to think about when we're thinking about how we deal with authority. Like, again, running from church to church, that is antithetical to a New Testament principle. I've addressed spiritual abuse, but there's a lot of people who have ran from spiritual authority because you simply will not honor it. We also see the next community guideline is about commitment. Namely, you cannot have community without commitment. Those two things absolutely rely on one another. And we talk about Acts 2. It's sort of like the picture we all aspire to be as the church. It says this in Acts. It says the believers devoted themselves, right? So they were committed. They stuck. Literally, it's like this word sticky. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. You know, again, go back to the family analogy. Why is it that our biological families have a unique power and bond? It's because there's a certain sense that we can't get away from them. And even if you don't talk to your family, right? And some of us have had very difficult family of origin stories. But isn't there a sense where even if you've kind of created distance and there's estrangement, it's like they're still there. You can't really get away from them. And I think there's actually a positive aspect of that when we think about Christian community. What is baked into the idea of the church is a deep commitment to one another that says something along those lines of, come what may, I am committed to you. And there might be times where we disagree. There might be at times relational conflict. There might be times where I say something that hurts your feelings or you do something that's misunderstood. But yet at the end of the day, I've made a decision. Before all that, I've made a decision to be committed to you and to be committed to one another. Again, a big problem in church communities today is that we simply do not commit to one another. That church, the large gathering, even more when we talk about connecting in small groups, we have a huge deficit of commitment. We come to church when we want, when it is convenient. I did a little study. There was one poll that was trying to find attendance patterns for church attendance. And do you know what it listed being a regular church attender? Once every 5 weeks, you are by definition a regular attender. And I'm like, who designed this survey? Why don't you try showing up to 20% of your football practices? Are you playing on the team? Absolutely not. Are you going to be you'll probably be removed from the team because the assumption will be clearly this is not a commitment. This is not a priority. How are we supposed to create an effective team if you're only going to be here 20% of the time? Is it hot in here? Is it just, And there's a reason. So when we look at the New Testament church, they were devoted to one another. And we're not talking about life happens in vacation, but they were devoted. They were committed to one another. Because at the end of the day, I'm just sorry, you can't create a community without commitment. And I think for a lot of us, the degree of community we experience is actually a reflection of the degree of commitment we are willing to offer. And I think in here, there's probably some people, you could say, hey, you know what? I know what community is like because, they've been here for me. You've been incredibly impacted by your community. But guess what? I'm going to look at that. Guess what? You were committed to that community. That's why it has been transformational. That's why it has been so powerful in your life. It's because you made a commitment to it. We'll talk more about this next week, but I just want to, put that on the table. I do not think that it is the teaching of Scripture that community and that commitment is an option. We've done a great disservice to you. Pastors like me saying, you know what, believe in Jesus, you get to go to heaven, and you know what, the rest of the stuff in the middle, we'll just kind of chalk that up to whether you want to do it or not. It's a totally foreign concept to Paul, to Jesus. And I think it should maybe cause us to pause about how we think about our shared life together. Commitment equals community. The last law, if this has been a bit of a beatdown, this one kind of ends on a happy note. I think the last and most important law, rule, principle is what Paul calls the law of love. Which, remember, that's why we're all here. It's because we've experienced the love of God. It's because we desire to show that love to others and experience that in a unique way. Paul writes this to the church at Rome, who I'm convinced that Paul, one of his reasons for writing the letter to the Romans is actually to help Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians love one another and get along in community. And so he writes at the very conclusion of this letter, he says, owe nothing to anyone except, this little small thing, except your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. For the commandments say, you must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not covet. These and other such commandments are summed up in this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to others, and so love fulfills the requirements of God's law. It's such a powerful and inspirational and aspirational teaching, I think, because it really gets to the heart of why we're here in the first place. And we're here to be a church of grace. We want to be a church that accepts and shows the love of God to a world that is desperately in need of it. And so for us, it puts it right back into our lap. The most important rule is the rule of love. The most important law is the law of love. And we see this play out in the New Testament. There's several dozen instances of what are usually called the one anothering passages. They're specifically geared to what we do with and for one another. And there's two types. There's negative ones, there's positive ones. The negative ones are things like this. Do not lie to one another. It's Colossians 3. Do not pass judgment on one another. Do not bite and devour one another. Do not slander one another. Do not grumble against one another. And these are important. I imagine many of us have been probably maybe on the receiving end of some of these. But more importantly, there's way more positive commands. A positive vision for how we are to practically embody the law of love. And I think there's just value. I'm not going to try to explain or preach. I just want to just steep in these together this morning as we think about what it means to embody these commands, this command to love in the context of community. Love one another. Be devoted to one another. Honor one another above yourselves. Live in harmony with one another. Build up one another. Be like-minded or unified toward one another. Accept one another. Admonish one another. Greet one another. Care for one another. Serve one another. Bear one another's burdens. Forgive one another. Be patient with one another. Speak the truth in love to one another. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Speak to one another with hymns, spiritual songs, and psalms. Submit to one another. Consider others better than yourselves. Look to the interests of one another. Bear with one another. Teach one another. Comfort one another. Encourage one another. Exhort one another. Stir up or provoke one another to love and good works. Show hospitality to one another. Employ the gifts that God has given us for the benefit of one another. Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. Pray for one another. Confess your faults to one another. I think when we look at these in totality, we start to see how we're supposed to embody this law of love. And for us, I think this is an opportunity for us as a church, as a group of brothers and sisters who are doing our best to create a kind of community that reflects good things about Christ and wants to preach the gospel by the way that we interact with one another. I think this is just a fantastic opportunity for us just to pause and to do an inventory. That as we're thinking about the type of community we want to be, like how are we doing in these areas? And my guess is that on balance, I think at Bridgeway, I know from my experience, Bridgeway is the healthiest church I've ever been a part of, by far. We have our flaws, we have our problems, we will always have flaws and problems, but on balance, it is the healthiest church that I've ever been a part of. And that's when people ask me, what do you love most about Bridgeway? It's usually right at the top of the list of the things I talk about, is the health of our community. Is that we do our best to one another. But for us, it's still an opportunity. Like for instance, what is our personal relationship to the authority that God has placed in our lives? Like, have you ever been in a position where you were confronted by a spiritual leader, by a small group, or maybe by a group of brothers and sisters were submitted to? Like, what was your response to that situation? Doesn't mean they were perfect. Doesn't mean they were perfectly right on what they said. But how did you respond and honor the godly authority that God has placed in your life? How are we doing in the area of commitment? And again, I think there's a lot of people, you're like, hey, I'm here and there are a lot of people at Bridgeway who you are committed and faithful. And I want to commend you, not because it's good for the church, it's good for you and it's frankly what Scripture tells us to do. But how are we in the area of commitment? If church were a sports team, would you be potentially a starter? Or would you be off the team? And then finally, and most importantly, how are we embodying the law of love? How are we showing in practical ways that we care for one another? And that the same grace and love that we've received from God, we want to share that in the context of our life together. And I'm hoping that for you and for me, I know I've been thinking about this, and there's some areas where I think there's some really great examples in my life. There's also some things I need to work on. And so I'm just going to ask us just to take a moment to allow the Spirit to speak to us and to be quiet for a moment, and I'll lead us in a prayer as we conclude today. But let's just quiet ourselves before God and ask him to speak to us.